Okay. Welcome, folks. Welcome to the NNJR Driver Seminar. I'm going to give folks a minute to get on so they can see and hear us.
Hello, all.
Howdy.
I'm going to see if I've got my screen sharing working on the big screen.
Hey, Bill. Hey, Grant.
Hi, all.
Hey.
Hey, folks. So in a minute or two, just so everyone knows, I will be muting folks, but I'll cover that in just a second. Some more people coming in. I'm going to give everyone a minute to get onto the Zoom, and then we'll get started here. Okay. All right. So welcome everyone. I'm going to mute everyone, but I'm going to explain questions in a moment. So again, welcome. I'm Bill Gilbert. I know most of you, but I see a couple of faces that I don't recognize. So welcome. One of NNJR chief instructors, welcome you to this year's driver seminar. Tom Calabro is on as a track chair, and our guest Pippa Mann is also on. So we'll get to her pretty quickly here, but a few things we're going to do before that. I am recording today's session, so if I can get it to start again, give me a second on that. Supposed to be recording here. Okay, there we go. So I'm recording this so that we can put it up on YouTube for the people that were not able to make it today. And I suggest that as we get into the presentation, you put your Zoom in speaker view so that you can see Pippa. And she will not be using slides. I will for a minute, and Tom. But if you can, leave your camera on, because Pippa likes to speak to an audience. So she likes to see who she's speaking with, and as do the rest of us for that matter. But I think it's a great strategy. So. With that said, let me get us started here with just a couple of things. So welcome to the driver seminar, and we're going to get going here with the season. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
Thank you, Bill. Well, first off, we have the same number of events that we had last year, although the dates have been shifted around a bit. We are again starting with Lightning 1 in April. Mid-Ohio is going to be a solo event this year. So if you're not in the white, black, or red group, and so it's only for those groups. Although there are some blue drivers, if you feel that you should be moving into the solo group, contact Craig and have a discussion with him on that. We will be doing that event in conjunction with the Mid-Ohio region PCA. And also what we will be doing is we're going to have a club race, Porsche club race, and which is exciting. It's great to be on the banks of the turn there, on the hillsides rather, and watch some of the people that you know go around the track, and not a DE session, but an actual race session. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Thunderbolt has its typical days in May, although they're normally a Friday and a Saturday. This year, they're going to be a Saturday and a Sunday. So if people have been staying away because they can't get away from work on Friday, there's no excuse this year. Also, we're going to run a intro to DE. So if you have any family members or friends that would like to try the track out, tell them to, we're going to be doing that on Saturday. We haven't finalized the format for that yet. In 2019, we did a full event where we had meetings, we had on track, we had autocross, We had some car control clinic rather. And so it's going to be, and then last year, we didn't do anything in 2020. Last year, because of COVID, we did a lead follow around the track during lunch, which doesn't sound really good. However, there were about 10 to 12 drivers last year, and about half of them signed up for events later in the year. They were so excited about it. So look for more information on that in the coming weeks. Pit race, my one comment from everybody, or the leading comment from everybody last year, which was our first year at pit race, was we don't want to do 2 days, we want to do 3 days. So it will be a 3-day event. Unfortunately, not a weekend involved, but it is 3 days. So we're working on getting weekends, very difficult. Lime Rock has moved again. We went, although we're not back in April, so you don't have to worry about the snow. It is in August, Monday, Tuesday. And again, that will be, last year we did the first day was instructed, and then the second day morning was instructed. This year it'll be 2 days instructed, and we're working out some of the logistics for getting some unmuffled cars on the track for Tuesday afternoon. But in any case, it'll be 2 full days of instructed. On the next slide, Bill, we have Summit Point. We're going back there again. A lot of people like that. Those who have been there love it, though it's a little disappointing in the number of people we had there. But I was practically begged by many of our members last year to make sure we keep it on the event. So if we'd like to keep it on, next time bring a friend. You know, we need more people for that event. Watkins Glen 1, it was supposed to move back to July. It's in August again this year. Sorry about that, but we will do the 3 days. Paul Miller, Porsche, is sponsoring us again this year. Very generous of them. We're going to be doing either a barbecue or a buffet like we did last year. So make sure you come to that. Bring your family to that event. Watkins Glen 2 is solo as normal. Lightning is in October, and we wind up the season at VIR for 3 days as our closeout to the season. One note on VIR, if you haven't booked rooms, I don't think there are any left at the track. Call them and see if you could get on a list, but it booked up very fast this year. Normally, they don't open the booking until the second week of January. I think by the second week of January, most of the rooms were gone. So there are other options. If you have any trouble, contact me and I'll try to help you out on that. That's it for the DE season.
Great. Okay, thanks, Tom. So let's just, let me do just a couple of minutes on an update for the 22 season, starting with a recap of 21. We had a great season in 21. Overall, numbers were up across the board, even compared to pre-COVID. Some of that, I'm sure everybody wanting to get back out, but we hope that trend continues, and every sign indicates it should continue for this year. The one black mark was the number of incidents. 1 is too many, 17 is 17 too many, but most were in red and black. So with advanced drivers and instructors, which shouldn't happen. So if that shoe fits for you, think about it, because most of those were driver error. And again, those kinds of things, this is a DE event, shouldn't be happening. For this season, we're going to continue the run group mentors that we started 2 years ago, but sorted out last year. We're also going to continue the Zoom and YouTube classes before the events, including the turn by turns, separate ones, one set of topics for students, one for solo drivers and instructors. The difference is going to be, we're going to do them 10 days to 2 weeks ahead so that they won't be jammed up in quite so close to the event and get in the way of the other things we all have to do to get ready to get to the track. And COVID permitting, we will add at the track classroom discussions this year. Same topic, but we're not going to do the presentation again. It'll be a discussion around whatever that topic happens to be for that particular event, as well as obviously any turn-by-turn questions and discussions that folks have. So by way of wrapping up, I want to just ask a couple of rhetorical questions. Why do you come to a DE? And maybe just as importantly, why do you come back? Well, we have some insights and answers to those questions from the surveys that we do after some events. And so I look back at surveys after a couple of events last year for some of the answers, and starting with the question of, what did you like best about this event? And 3 themes jumped out at me when I did that. The first one was, these are organized events, they're safe, and obviously fun, but this slide, you don't have to read it. It's just all about all the things people said, that the event was well run, it was professional, it was organized and safe. The second theme that showed up, was people. People come because they meet nice people. They come to see old friends. People were great. People were helpful. People were friendly. So not surprisingly, in the Porsche Club, people camaraderie was a big factor. And then the third factor for students, and actually some of these comments came from people who are not students, was instruction and learning. After all, it is called driver's education, right? So not surprising that what people can learn and how they learn was a big reason why they came. So in summary, you all hear us talk about DE being safe, serious, fun. Well, these, this feedback reinforces that. And it's because it is organized. It's because the people are great, right, and helpful, and we get to learn from people who know more about driving than perhaps we do, and even those of us who have been driving a long time always learn something, right? That's one of the benefits of being an instructor. I learn from my students as well as from other sources. So with that, I've turned off the slides. I'm going to turn the microphone back to Tom to introduce Pippa.
Bill, thank you very much. Speaking of learning, I'm very confident you're all going to learn a lot from Pippa this afternoon. Pippa is an open wheel race winner in Indy Lights and a 7-time Indianapolis 500 competitor in IndyCar. She also became the first woman to break the 230 mile/hour barrier around the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. She earns her living coaching and co-driving in a variety of sports car series across America, and has also won the 24-hour race at the Nürburgring with her teammates in 2021. Besides her private coaching work and racing schedule, Pippa is also one of the instructors at the Porsche track experience at Barber Motorsports Park. Pippa has been a past commentator for IndyCar Radio on the IndyCar Series and Indy Light Series. With all her work racing, commenting, coaching, public speaking, and her schedule, we are very excited to welcome Pippa Mann. Pippa, thank you for joining us, and let's give a warm welcome to Pippa Mann.
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you so much again for having me this afternoon. I promise to try not to bore you all to tears too many times in the course of the next 90 minutes or so. As mentioned by Tom, I do earn my living these days coaching and co-driving and working for Porsche Track Experience down in Birmingham. I've also worked for several other car brands. I work for a couple of other car schools, and I spend a lot of my time both with private clients whom are going racing, and through my work with Porsche Track Experience and the schools with some newer drivers who may be very new to racing. So it's very cool to be here and to be speaking to you all this afternoon. And the place I would most like to start with this is starting with the fundamentals. It sounds boring, but starting with the fundamentals first and getting them right first is always the most important thing to setting yourself up for success. It's like building a foundation for a house. You have to build the right foundation so that you can then build on top of that to have the house you want to live in. Coming to HPDE events, DE events, and driving on racetracks is much the same way. Setting our foundation is really important. And the first thing you're going to hear me say is something that Bill and Tom have already mentioned. And you're going to hear mentioned at every driver's meeting that you go to this year with these guys. And you're probably going to hear it more than once in this presentation because it bears repeating many, many times. You are not coming to a race event. You guys are going to a racetrack. There are two different things there. Going to a race event is when you're literally showing up with a race car, trying to get the maximum possible performance from that race car for that race event. Showing up to an HPDE event, you are taking most likely your road car and you are trying to have fun driving it on a racetrack. We want other people to have fun around you while you're driving it on the racetrack. We want you to be as safe as possible while you're driving it on the racetrack while still having fun. So we're not trying to be killjoys, but it is something that's going to be peppered in and out of this little presentation as we go, because it is kind of a sort of semi-serious subject. And the point being that when you get to the point where you are trying to find the last few tenths and you really are ready to go racing, well, track days in your personal car can still be a ton of fun, but maybe you're getting to the point where you should start to go racing. The first thing to think about when you go to any track day, whether it's a race event or whether it's an HPDE event, is your vision. Your vision is going to be the most important thing that sets you up for success or for failure, quite frankly. Whether you know the track, whether you know the car, or whether you don't know either, keeping your eyes up and looking ahead is really, really important. As you start out at a brand new racetrack, every lap you do, your eyes are giving your brain information. And it's kind of subliminal information. You don't actually really have to think about the information too much. It's like if I yelled Tom's name and just like threw a tennis ball towards him, Tom wouldn't have to go through the thought process of, oh, I see the tennis ball coming, maybe I should put my hand up and try and catch it, right? It's just an automatic reaction. You put your hand up, you try to catch the ball. That's your eyes giving your brain information that's kind of subliminal, that you don't even really have to think about. The information just comes in. When you are at a racetrack, it's kind of a similar deal. If you are giving your brain the correct information, then your brain can really, really help you. Your goal in your first laps at a new racetrack should not be to go as fast as you can. Your goal should be to start building, seeing the correct things again and again and again and again, so that as you get faster, knowing whether you're on the right line or not starts to become subliminal. I'm going to be really annoying and break here for a moment. Could you guys just check you are on mute for me? I think somebody has managed to knock their mic on somewhere, maybe on the second screen. It'd be really cool if you guys could do that, because we can hear somebody's just kind of like screen cutting in a little bit. So vision is your first fundamental thing to get right when you come to a racetrack. And not just when you're learning a new track. The faster you get, the better you get. The faster car you're driving, the further ahead of the car you have to be able to look. If you can look far enough ahead of the car, you can actually slow things down, and they happen at a rate of speed that you're much more comfortable with. As humans, we're actually evolved to have a fight or flight reflex in situations where we feel stressed and where we feel threatened. So that means that when you're driving a car and your heart rate gets really, really high, you have to work to stop this instinct from kicking in. Because back in the caveman days, when you were in trouble and that fight or flight reflex kicked in, you were literally either like going to get into a fist fight with somebody up close, or you were going to run as fast as you could and flight to get away from that situation. In either of those instances, actually having your vision pretty close to you was really, really helpful, right? It's close if you're in a fight to have your vision close to yourself. And if you're running, let's face it, humans don't run that fast. Even Usain Bolt doesn't run that fast. So your vision doesn't need to be very far ahead of you when you're running to try and get away from a situation. So that's why it's so important when you are in a car to make sure your vision is up and looking ahead, and you actually have that conversation with yourself if you find yourself looking too close to the front of the car. Eyes up, eyes ahead. It'll make all of the inputs you put into the car smoother. It'll make it seem easier because things will slow down. And you won't find yourself catching traffic in awkward places where you didn't expect it, because you'll see that traffic much sooner in the lap and be able to better judge your closing speed. The second fundamental thing we want to talk about after vision, setting yourself up to have a good time, is we already talked about building up to speed slowly at first and setting the correct sight picture. Your vision is also really useful to give your brain information about track conditions. Sounds really obvious, but when you're at a new track or you're at a racetrack where the conditions are, a little bit changeable, making sure you're spotting where there's those colors in change, where those color changes in the pavement, that's really, really helpful, especially if it's damp or drying. That can tell you where the racetrack has more grip or less grip. If the racetrack is generally a little wetter, look for the shiny areas of racetrack. Anywhere where the racetrack is shiny, you have less grip. It's going to be more slippery. So really using your vision to give your brain that information as you're learning the racetrack is super important. You also heard me say that good vision helps your hands be smoother. Having smooth hand inputs into the car is one of those really important driving fundamentals that, as you get better and faster, will help you continue to get better and faster. I see a lot of people who are new to performance driving, they start driving and their hands start here at 9 and 3, and then they come up and up and up the wheel like this as they get more and more stressed and they start going more quickly. So if you're guilty of that when you're driving, make a concerted effort to try and help keep your hands balanced in that sort of 9 and 3 position. It helps you keep the race car balanced. And I don't know what the actual biological sort of reason for this is, unlike the fight or flight thing in your vision, but I believe it's something to do with your inner ear balance, that when your hands are in that balanced position, it helps you make the car feel more balanced. And then in literal terms, it also stops you turning the wheel too quick. If you slide your hands up the wheel, it is easier to turn the wheel too fast and literally give yourself oversteer that actually doesn't exist. It only exists because you're trying to turn the wheel that fast. The next fundamental thing I want to talk about is your correct braking and accelerating techniques. Again, fundamentals first. We're starting with the basics before we move on to the next round of things. Do not treat your gas pedal like a light switch. It is not either on or off. Roll to the gas pedal, squeeze on the gas. Even if you can get to full throttle pretty quickly, you should never go to 0 to 100 like that. There should always be a process of rolling through the various percentages to get from 0 back to 100% gas. With the brake pedal, you should always be trying to work on a braking technique where you brake firmly initially, and then you are softening the brake pedal as you approach the corner. As you get better and you become a faster driver, this softening as you approach the corner will start to turn into trail braking, which is where you have a tiny bit of brake. Maybe if your maximum brake is an 8 or 9 out of 10, maybe this is like a 1 out of 10, still with the brake pedal as you're starting to add steering. That's a little more advanced, but to be able to progress to that, we need to first of all get used to this idea that what we're doing with the brake pedal is the complete opposite to what we do with the brake pedal in street driving. Because in street driving, we start softly, and then we add, and then we add, and then we add. But on a racetrack, you want to start firmly, and then soften, and soften, and soften. Anytime you're on a racetrack and you feel yourself having to add that brake pressure as you are getting towards the corner, 1, either you did not brake hard enough to begin with, or 2, you tried to brake too late for that corner, either for your car or even just for where you currently are in your learning curve. So committing to that correct braking technique is really, really important. Do me a favor, wave at me if you have manual cars with clutches. Okay, lots of people waving at me. So when you have a manual car, the next thing you want to add into this is everybody talks about heel and toe. Heel and toe is necessary with 10 to 20% of cars, but here's the deal. Learning how to use the clutch properly first is what you need to do before you learn how to heel and toe. How do I learn how to use the clutch properly first without damaging my car if I'm not heeling and towing? Well, first of all, extend your brake zone. Make sure your brake zone is fairly long so that nothing is rushed in your brake zone. And then you should be on the brakes completely independently to being on the clutch. I'm going to hold my hands up to the screen here and see if this works. Okay, so you're on the brakes, then boom, boom, boom. Those are timed as you are making the downshifts with your right hand. If you do this smoothly and you are smooth on and off the clutch, especially with this more extended brake zone, as you're making sure you have this technique correct, you actually won't need to heel and tow, again, 90% or more of cars at that point in time. The reason I emphasize this is a lot of people, when they're driving a manual car on a racetrack, have a really bad habit of doing that with both their pedals. So that's clutch all the way in and brakes all the way in. And that is what we do not want you to see you doing. We want to see you using the brake pedal to slow the car and the clutch pedal just for those downshifts. Once that becomes easy and you feel confident and competent, then still don't compress your brakes up. Then you can start to add boom, boom, boom. I know it's a little hard to see with the background being a little blurred behind me. I have a virtual background because nobody wants to see my wall that I'm sitting at. Race cars are far more fun. But the point is start out with that extended brake zone, continue with it, and commit to having that big extended brake zone so that you have the time to work on your technique. Because while you might tell me that I'm going to damage my car if I don't heel toe all of my downshifts, I can promise you, you will damage your gearbox far quicker if you are doing scruffy, crummy heel toe downshifts, and your gearbox will be far happier if you're shifting without heel and toe, but doing it nice and smooth and gentle and correctly. So that's just something to bear in mind. Now, here's the other really big deal about all of this. Is I'm talking about a lot of technique stuff that sounds pretty simple, but if you try to rush it, these techniques just kind of keep getting away from you. When you're at the beginning of your journey of performance driving, or when you're learning a new racetrack, equally as important, it's really, really, really important to commit to focusing time and effort on doing the right things. The easiest way to become a better driver and to find lap time on racetracks is to keep doing the right things and let the lap time come to you. The hardest way to find lap time on a racetrack is to go out there and try chase it. Just ask me. I'm a race car driver. I've made that mistake so many times in my career, I don't want to even talk about it. And I'm sure all of you have had days where you've made that mistake too. You're chasing the lap time, the techniques go out the window, everything gets scruffy. Always focus on the technique part of things first. However, at HPDE, you guys are lucky. You guys have instructors to help you. They are not there as the fun police, I promise. I promise they're not. They want to help you get better and they want to help you get faster. And sometimes, just as I've been telling you, that's going to be asking you to drive a little slower so that you can do all of the right things, right? So that you're braking in the right place, so that you have the correct braking technique, so that your turning points and apexes are looking good, so that your rollback to throttle technique is correct. I also want all of you guys to remember, and I'm sure you're going to be told this year until you are sick of the death of it, but when you have somebody getting into that right seat next to you, it is a privilege. Do not abuse that privilege. That person getting into that right seat, they've probably seen a lot by this point. You can't impress them. If you try and impress them with anything other than your great techniques, excuse my language, guys, you're probably just going to piss them off. Because trust me, we're already scared enough when we have to get into your right seats. We don't need you guys going out there trying to impress us with how fast you are. What will really impress us is how good you are with your techniques. So we're like, oh yeah, this person's getting it. This person's really getting it. This person's looking ahead. They've got their eyes up. Their footwork's really good. Their lines are looking good. That's what we want when we're sitting next to you. And the final thing is, don't forget to ask your instructors for advice in this fundamentals first part of the talk. They are there to help you. When you have questions, ask them. If there's a section of the racetrack that you're just not getting, even though they're trying to help you with, ask them. If you want to ride along with them and see some of the racetrack, just one group up being driven by them so that you have a visual of what they're doing and trying to get you to do, ask them. Your instructors are there to try and help you have a better experience, to help you learn how to drive your car quickly and safely on the racetrack and have a great time with your road car. At this point, we're going to pause for just a couple of minutes and see whether we have any questions about this real sort of kind of fundamental beginning stuff, and then we'll move on. Oh, Bill, you're still on mute. Hang on.
Sorry about that. So I'll remind everyone to type any questions in the chat. You can also raise your virtual hand and we'll look for it. But while I'm looking for other questions, one that we talked about this morning or earlier today, I should say, was the question I had was, which of these fundamentals is hardest in your experience for people to master or to learn? As you say, they're all at one level sound pretty simple, but we all know they aren't. So what's the one or two that are the hardest, you think, for people typically to learn?
I think the most important is the vision, because generally almost everything stems from having really good vision. And I think the second most important, but possibly the hardest, is discipline. The discipline to slow down enough so that you can do everything right, enough times that doing it right starts to become more automatic, so that you have to donate less brain space just to doing the fundamentals right. If you're having to think that hard about all of the fundamentals still, you need to be going slow enough to give yourself the time to do them. So to me, vision and then the discipline required to not just keep pushing to go faster, 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 but to actually say, I'm going to hold until I've got this, and then I'm going to go faster.
Great. Other questions? Anybody have a hand up? I don't see any. Here's a question. Do you advocate teaching trail braking right away, or is that something that comes later with a new student?
So I advocate teaching firmly to the brake at first and then softening towards the corner. And you'll notice I use the word softening rather than trail braking. So I advocate teaching that from the get-go, because from that, you can lead into trail braking when somebody's ready without having to change anything that they've already learned, right? From then, it just becomes a point of refining the technique. And the reason I use the word soften is because that's what I want my new student to do with the pedal. I want them to brake firmly and then soften, soften, soften as I'm approaching the corner. So that's how I would go about it.
Great, great. Anyone else?
Okay.
Go ahead. Yep.
So the second thing on the list to chat to you guys about is the whole situational awareness part of this. You are on track with other people of different experience levels, people of different speed. And we're all the way back to that vision thing again. Whenever I'm working down in Alabama and we are teaching the classes down there, I feel like I am beating people with a stick about this whole vision thing, because you just end up talking about it again and again and again. And when Bill asked me, that's why I thought it was one of the most important things, even if discipline is a very close second and the hardest thing. Anticipating what is happening ahead is one of the keys to cleaner, safer passing. And HPD and DE days are not racing. And so it is about having fast and safe fun. So if you're able to have those eyes much further ahead and really be watching what's happening, watching your closing speed to traffic, watching how that car's driving, because let's be honest, if that car is not only going a little slower, but they're also kind of a bit offline, that driver's probably pretty overwhelmed right now. They're probably quite new. So pay attention. Be heads up as you're catching that slower car, like, hey, I'm not as sure about this. In the same vein, make sure you glance in the mirrors. Now, this is a hard thing to do, making sure you have that look and then keep that vision forwards again. But it is something that as you do HPDE that you need to kind of learn how to do effectively. What I like to say to people is glance in the mirrors as you exit the corner. So you've already pretty much unwound your hands, you're accelerating out of the corner, everything feels good, it's nice and smooth. That's the point at which you glance behind you. Don't ever glance in the mirrors as you're approaching any kind of braking zone or turn-in point. Glance at the mirrors as you're coming onto straights and at corner exits when you have things more under control, because that's the appropriate time to kind of look and keep looking forwards. Again, to touch on my job that I do in Birmingham, Alabama, one of the things I do is we do lead follow training. And so that involves me driving around with a radio in one hand and literally like looking backwards while going forwards. And to give you a little story to that, when I was very, very new at my job working for Porsche Track Experience in Birmingham, you have to get signed off on the various levels of coaching there, no matter whom you are. And so, you know, I'd been signed off to start doing the lead follow part of it. And, you know, I had this very, very quick group and they were online and quite good. So I was prepared to kind of like keep doling out like a little more rope and a little more rope. I'm like, they're quite good. And so I came in from that session. And by the way, the group was, I'm trying to think of a polite way to say this. So they were South American, and certainly the father of the group was fairly unsure before the session started about him and his sons being sent to, you know, the girl leading them around, quite frankly. He got over that during the session, but I came in at the end of the session and my boss was like, okay, you're on hot laps today. And I'm like, wait, okay. And of course, the first person who gets in my car is the dad of these guys, whom I've been leading around, quite frankly, about as quickly as I could go whilst looking backwards with one hand on the wheel, talking into a radio. Like I didn't have much left if they were good enough to go faster than that at that point in time. And I'm thinking, oh, great, here we go. Now, first ever hot lap that I'm going to do. First time I ever drive one of these cars actually at speed. I've got one of the fastest people in this entire school sitting next to me, who is only just getting over his prejudice about being led around the racetrack by me. Like, perfect. Now, funnily enough, apparently me telling everybody else eyes up, looks forwards. Apparently you can drive the car quite a bit faster when you have your eyes up looking forwards without a real issue. To the extent that we came back to pit lane at the end of his hot lap and the guy looks at me. Little girl, you can drive. I took that as a compliment. It was intended as a compliment. I didn't take it offense. Yeah, I see somebody laughing. I didn't take, didn't take offense at the way it was phrased. I knew what he meant. He was being nice. But the point is that even taking my own advice, now I no longer have to spend 3/4 of my lap looking out my back window, and I could spend all of it looking out my front window, aside from a couple of glances at appropriate points. Able to go quite a lot quicker without thinking about it. So that's how important your vision is, no matter your experience level. One of the things to think about when you're being around other people is a clean pass is pretty much always the responsibility of the car passing to ensure that that pass happens cleanly. Now, we've talked about how this starts with your vision and anticipating what's happening ahead. Does that driver seem comfortable? Have they seemed confident? Make sure that you're doing the right things. Don't tailgate the person, just present yourself. However, if you are the car being passed, you also have some responsibility in this situation, even when we say it's a responsibility of the passing car. Your responsibility is threefold. One, you have a responsibility to glance in your mirrors and give the point by appropriately early. Two, you have the responsibility to stay on the racing line and not kind of deviate or wander when you give the point by. So if you're coming down the front straight of Watkins Glen, for example, and you're telling somebody to point you by on the right, don't like wander towards the middle of the track because you're like looking as they come. Make sure you keep your car straight as you give that point by. The third responsibility you have, once that car pulls out, you've given him the point by, they've pulled out, crack off the throttle. I'm not saying you necessarily have to lift entirely. I'm not saying go slow. I'm saying make it easy on both of you. Crack throttle. Allow that car to pass you. It might be a slower car than you with a more experienced driver. It might be a similar speed car to you. Don't just stay flat out matted to the floor giving the point by and wonder why the driver isn't coming. Make sure you do your part with cracking out of the throttle enough to facilitate that pass happening easily. Even in real life racing situations, this happens. This past weekend, my teammates and I were competing in an 8-hour race down at NOLA. And unfortunately, one of our drivers had contact earlier in the race. So we were a couple of laps down as a penalty on a lot of our competition. One of the guys who was the same speed as me, but whom I was not racing because we were 2 laps down, was behind me and sort of doing this in traffic. And I'm like, you know what? I'm not racing this guy. I don't need to interfere with his race. I would like him to race me the right way at some point later in the season. So as we approached one of the passing zones, I made it very clear that I was staying to the outside. He was thinking of popping, so I cracked off the throttle early, made it easy for him to get alongside. I braked a little earlier than normal, and I tucked right in behind him at the apex, and off we went. Facilitating a pass doesn't make you weak, it makes you smart, especially in HPDE situations. And being smart helps everybody have a fun time. So just because the pass is a responsibility of the driver coming past you, that does not absolve you of your responsibility in the situation either. And then the final thing about situational awareness is to be aware if there's a situation that you are struggling with. Maybe this is a part of the racetrack you're struggling with, but maybe it's a traffic situation you're struggling with. There are more experienced people at these HPDE events. Go talk to your instructor. Go talk to the chief instructor. Go talk to some more experienced people. Ask for help. Ask for advice. That's what people are there for. They want you to have fun. They want you to be safe. And they want to help you figure out those tough situations. So that's kind of the end of the little situational awareness part of this. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to throw at me for that?
We had a couple come in. One, not exactly for situational awareness, but relates to beginning drivers. The question was, do you recommend, do you advocate using e-racing for training and practice, or is it not advised for beginners?
So I really like using online sims to help me learn the basics of the racetrack. So where does it go left? Where does it go right? Is this a fast corner? Is this a slow corner? It gives you a baseline. You do, in my opinion, you do not want to use online e-racing, iRacing to try and learn car control, to try and learn specifics of a racetrack like break points, minimum speeds, because at that point, the consequences of an issue in the real world are so much bigger than they are if you're just practicing in the I or e-racing world. So for learning a racetrack, I think it's a pretty good tool. But if you're actually using it to kind of to dig in depth or really improve your car control, you want to be a little careful because you can get some false information.
Yeah, great. And so the other question, you may touch on this later, but we'll put it in here now. Do you recommend doing a track walk? And if so, what do you think about walking the track in reverse?
I recommend doing a track walk whenever possible. I don't recommend walking a track in reverse, but I do recommend standing at the apex and turning around and looking back at your entry point. And then once you've walked out to your exit, turning around and standing back to look at your apex. I don't recommend walking the track in reverse because what you're trying to do when you're learning a new racetrack is you're trying to build up a picture of the racetrack that your brain can remember so that as much of it as possible, as quickly as possible, effectively becomes automatic. It's almost subconscious. You know which way it's going to go next and roughly what corner the next speed is without even having to think about it. So that's why I recommend walking forwards, because you're starting to build the correct sight picture, even at that very slow speed. But turning around at apexes and looking back, or turning around at exits and looking back, that's fine too. That's just giving you a different perspective.
Great. So on situational awareness, to come back to that for a moment, obviously it's easy for a new driver to get overloaded in traffic or get fixated on the mirrors, that sort of thing. I've seen the same thing happen even when a driver moves up a run group or two. All of a sudden, the traffic is faster, and so the overload happens again. So, what's your advice for kind of overcoming that overload? What are the techniques to get yourself prepared and therefore not in that position or get out of it?
So again, it all comes down to vision, right? Having the ability to move that focus back forwards, to glance backwards and then move forwards. And even though you're going to say to me, but Pippa, you're telling me to make the speed disparity bigger and I already feel like I'm being run over in this group, slow it down a little bit. Give yourself the free mental capacity to be able to deliberately move your vision forwards and glance backwards and move your vision forwards again. If you're really overwhelmed and you want to step back one group in terms of speed, go talk to the chief instructor. Nobody's going to look at you and think you're, a dummy for wanting to do that. They're going to say, hey, if that's where you're most comfortable and you'd like to do a few more sessions there, absolutely. But the big thing is make sure you slow down your driving enough to give yourself the spare brain space. Because if you're using all of your mental capacity to drive as fast as you possibly can, everything gets overwhelming in a hurry.
Great. Okay.
So the next thing I want to talk about, and we touched on this briefly in the answers to one of the questions about sim racing, is car control. Because I advocated for not using a sim to try and learn car control, because I think sometimes the translation to real world, both in terms of car control and consequences, can be a little thrown off. You're coming to the track on these HPDE days and DE days to enjoy your car and to enjoy driving on the track and to have fun with your car and to have fun driving on the track. And for most of you, I'm guessing this is also the car you drove to the track. So Bill and Tom and you and your instructor would all very, very much like you to be able to drive that car home from the track, which means not having to hurt it. So you should always keep the car nannies engaged, especially at first, even if they're annoying. Always start out with those systems turned on, especially when you come to a new track, especially if it's a new type of car, especially if you're with a new group, especially if the weather's inclement, especially the first sessions of the weekend, the 2-day event, even if you normally run with them off. Always start with that stuff switched on. What you're doing is you're giving yourself a safety net. Real race car drivers crash cars. We make mistakes and we crash cars. We make mistakes because we're human. We're driving as fast as we can on the limit, as much as we can. Occasionally, we screw it up. That's when we make a mess of our race cars, and it's really, really not pretty. We generally don't have anything to help save us. You guys have some tools and trickery to help save you. Now, in modern cars, like the Cayman Club Sport GT4, and most of the really modern Porsches, the PSM is actually really, really good. Like, it is staggeringly good. It interferes relatively little unless you're really leaning on it. And you can actually run the cars almost as quick with it on as you can with it off at way less risk. Actually, the Cayman Club Sport GT4 race car that I'm running with some guys this year, we went to Homestead earlier this year to shake the car down. It was the first time I'd ever driven it. And so one of the things I do when I get in a new race car is I go through the various settings. Now, in the championship that we're running this car on, we're running it on street tires rather than full slick tires. So I was going through the various ABS settings, and then on a set of the new street tires, I did 2 laps with the, TC on, the PSM on, and I did 2 laps with it off. I was 0.2 quicker with it off, 0.2. And we're going to run this car in 8-hour races with 3 amateur drivers and me at the wheel. So I turned around to the drivers who were sharing the car with me, whose car it is, and I'm like, okay, it looks like most of the racetracks we go to this year, we're actually going to race with that sucker on. Because quite frankly, for 0.2 on new tires, okay, I might do it in qualifying, but for 0.2 over a race distance, it's not worth the extra risk versus the reward for 0.2 over 8 hours. We're not talking a second or 2 seconds here. We're talking 0.2. So I was really, really surprised by that and quite shocked. In my role at Barber, when we get into open lapping sessions, I've also stood on the outside of corners, the S's at Barber being very notorious for this, and watched cars get like the most ridiculous amount of yaw angle in them, to the point they're almost perpendicular to the racetrack, and they go straighten back up. That ain't the driver. A car gets that sideways, an electronic system has intervened to save them. So at Porsche, we actually have a nickname for PSM. We call it "Please Save Me." And we are constantly beating on the people who come through our courses to not rely on it. They are not allowed to turn it off, but similarly, they are not allowed to rely on it. Like, I hear somebody coming through the corner just leaning all the way into that. I'm like, really? Really? Could you and I have a conversation about what would have happened to you if you didn't have that on, please? And so that's something I want you to think about. When you're driving and if you're in a fairly modern car and you're driving it and you're thinking that, these nannies are so annoying and they're really holding me back. Are they really holding you back, or are you not driving very smoothly and leaning into them a bit too hard? Now, with some older generation cars and some cars of other manufacturers, admittedly, sometimes these systems are not as good, and they do overly interfere once you get to a certain level of driving and a certain level of driving at speed. Again, always start your race event, your HPDE event, with it on. Always have it on in inclement weather. You always have to have it on when an instructor gets in the car next to you. You always want to have it on at a new racetrack. Once you get to the point where you have already done a lot of driving and you've been to somewhere like Porsche Track Experience and been beaten with a stick by somebody like me on a skid pad, sliding the car around, and you already have that sort of fundamental grasp of what it's going to feel like when the car slides and how to correct it without that safety net. If you are determined at that point in time that this is the next step for you, make sure you back your pace down fairly significantly, especially for your first session that you might be running on a track without those aids. Having that pace backed down will give you much more time to think about things you are doing and then build up to speed slowly, one small step at a time, being especially cautious and careful in any of the areas of the racetrack where you felt that your driver aids were holding you back. Because the fact that they were interfering meant that potentially you needed their help a little more than you thought. And even with the older cars, where arguably, they do interfere too much once you get to a certain stage, they were doing something there, even if you didn't like it. So approach those areas even more so with caution, especially. Personally, I am a really, really, really strong advocate of getting people to go and do skid pad training before you try and drive without driver aids on. Learning how to be comfortable, sliding the car around, making the correct corrections, putting in the opposite lock, getting that stuff to be second nature before you do it, to me, is really, really important. I also want you to think about whether you want to go racing, right? If your car's nannies are actually really quite good, and you're really determined to find those last 2 tenths like I did at Homestead by turning them off, should you be doing this in an HPDE day, or should you be trying to go racing? Is it time to step up and like, okay, I'm actually going to go drive a race car on a test and tune day or on a track day, where taking that level of risk is more acceptable and it's not the car that I want to be able to drive home at the end of the day? So for those of you who are really in that position of wanting to extract every last thing from your, like every last tenth of a second from your car, have that serious and honest conversation with yourself. Now, a lot of you are going to say to me, but racing's so expensive. I understand racing is expensive. However, what I am going to say to you is a track day in a spec Miata is not glamorous, and it is not that expensive. And you will find out pretty quickly whether you have car control or not, and how well you're doing without the driver aids. And if you do make a mistake in that Spec Miata, one, it has a full roll cage. Two, you have a full safety harness in there with all of the appropriate racing gear for racing, the appropriate safety gear, which is different from a track day. It's up another level. And finally, frankly, it's not that expensive to fix a Miata most of the time. We'll pretend I didn't have to say that last bit, but you guys know what I mean. Because here's the deal. And I've said this once and I'm going to say it again. When you are really, really pushing the limits, at some point you're going to make a mistake. This is not me like talking down to you. I'm telling you as a human being. I make mistakes. You're going to make a mistake too. Everybody makes mistakes. It's part of being human. However, understanding the consequence of that mistake and whether, you really are there just to have fun and enjoy it. And if you are further away from the limit in general, the mistakes have less consequences. The closer you are to the limit in general, the faster you are going, the less margin for error there is. And if you have the nannies turned off, those mistakes can get big in a hurry. So that's the portion of this on kind of nannies and car control. And I'd love to open up and find out if there's anything you guys would like me to cover more on that subject. And then we'll get into some data and video stuff next.
Great. Great. So folks, if you have a question, raise your hand or type it in. One question I want to ask related to nannies is if you're a beginning driver or a driver with limited experience, how do you know these things are actually intervening? What are the telltale signs? I'm assuming an experienced driver should know that the PSM light's coming on or that sort of thing. But if you're a less experienced driver, what would you be looking for?
Generally, the big flickering PSM light, the car tends to cut power to the driving wheels. And some of the systems actually also help apply the brakes to straighten the car up a little bit. Certainly the modern PSM systems, the only reason a car can get that sideways and ever straighten itself up again is because the PSM system literally applied the two brakes, went and like pulled the car back into line. So you should be able to tell. But if you are new or less experienced, your instructor will also help you with that, sitting in the seat next to you. And you also really shouldn't even be considering turning that stuff off yet.
Great. Okay. We had heard that on some of the, going back a couple of years, and this may still be true, that people who abuse these systems or even maybe didn't think they were abusing them, but they were intervening, found that like rear brake pads were wearing rapidly, or rear brake rotors were discolored. Is that still an accurate view of the world?
Yes, especially with a PSM system on Porsches, because it will apply brakes to help straighten the car. There's one brand who will remain nameless, but when I was working for them, their cars have very, very, very intrusive traction control systems. And this was at a very high level program that was mostly open lapping. But one of the people whom I was working with specifically had requested a tail. That means I get sent out with a radio to that car, literally to follow that car and talk to it on the radio as it's driving. And if you've worked in motorsport for a while, you would know this is quite normal. So that the customer obviously gets in a fairly fast car, and then the team thinks it's funny to give you the slowest possible car that might be able to keep up with that car if you drive it really, really hard. And the racetrack in question was Laguna Seca. And Laguna Seca has a very fast left-hander that goes up a hill, and it's kind of notorious. There's a compression at the apex. And then as you come out of the compression, everybody gets loose. Like the car does a big like wiggle sidestep as you're accelerating up the hill. And you actually jump over the curb there, and there's like a car width and a quarter of flat racetrack the other side of the curb that's not counted as track limits. The other side of that is a gravel track. So everybody hops over and uses this. It's not something we teach to do, But, you know, when you're trying to go fast, it's something you do. So I'm sent out after this guy, and it becomes obvious within like a lap that, you know, leaving the nannies on, because his car's so much faster than mine down the straight. So I have to drive this thing really hard. And in that particular brand, the interference was very intrusive. So I got about, you know, a lap into this, and I'm like, okay, flick, because like otherwise everybody's going to make fun of me for not being able to keep up with the customer. First turn I went into after flick was turn 6. I have never been that perpendicular to a racetrack with the radio in my hand while still talking to the customer ahead of me, because I tried to send the car in just as hard as I had the previous lap with all of the nannies to get down. I have some experience. I was fine. I was a little more circumspect the next lap when I sent it in there. The point is even when these aids are really, really intrusive, be very aware that they are doing something, and you will need to adjust your driving when you don't have them on, even if you're quite good.
Yeah, that's a great story. I love it. Okay. Other questions, folks?
This is a quiet group.
It is a quiet group. I'm surprised.
All right. Getting more in depth. We've talked about car control. Now we're going to talk about data and video a little bit. So, you know, started with the fundamentals and then awareness and kind of slowly building to these more complex topics. So data and video can be the most brilliant tool for really helping you when you're starting to get quite good and you want to figure out those last things that you're missing. However, once again, this point, we have to talk about the fact that you are not coming to HPDE to go racing. You are coming to HPDE to have fun driving your car. And if you want to get really, really serious with the data and video, but the next step is going to be to go racing. But it can help you improve during HPDE as well. The first thing is to make sure you always look for the low-hanging fruit first. What does that mean? It means when you watch your video back and you're like, you know what? I'm not being very consistent with my line in that corner. I need to back it up a little bit and make sure that I'm online every lap. So I build my brain that better sight picture I'm talking about. It can be, you know what? I keep missing the apex of that corner. You know what? I'm really struggling with the exit of that corner. I wonder if I'm turning in too early, because a lot of the times when you run out of road at the exit, it's because you turned in too soon. So watching your own video back can really help you sort of understand some of the things you're doing and some of the mistakes you're making before you ask for help with someone else. Watch what your car looks like when you're catching traffic, especially if you're in a solo run group. When you watch your video back, does it all look pretty calm and composed and controlled? Or when you watch it back, you're like, maybe I should look a little further up the road here, because on my video, that came up real fast. So pay attention to those kinds of things when you're watching your video back. Never take big swings at it. When you're talking to other people, when you start to overlay data on top of data, when you start to look at somebody else's video compared to your video, it can be really easy to be like, you know what? I need to go so much faster through this section of the racetrack. Don't do it. Go a little bit faster through that section of the racetrack. Get comfortable going a little bit faster. And then once that feels really good and it no longer feels fast, go a little bit faster. This applies especially to fast sections of the racetrack. If you are newer and you are still getting quicker and you are learning your car, very experienced drivers will probably be quite a lot quicker than you through the higher speed areas of the racetrack. These are high risk areas. These are the areas where if you make a mistake and something goes wrong, you may damage your car. Build up to it slowly. Understand that the people who are quicker than you probably have more experience than you. The second high risk place to try and find your speed is by attacking the brake zones in the wrong way. We already talked about how you want to start out with the correct braking technique of braking firmly at first and then softening that pedal into the corner. And how as you get better and better, this actually leads into trail braking, and the idea of holding like the 1 out of 10 brake on the nose of the car to help the car turn into the corner, to help it rotate as you're coming to the apex of the corner. However, don't be in a hurry to be the last of the late brakers. If you try to brake too late, you have to have maximum brake pressure for too long. You can't trail the brakes effectively into the corner. What does that mean? It means you can't soften the pedal properly as you're approaching the corner, which means the car won't turn into the corner properly because you probably have too much braking. You're overloading the front tires. You're asking them to do 80% of braking, and now you're asking them to do 80% of turning at the same time. And the front tires, I've only got 100% of grip. I can't do 160% of grip with you asking me to do 2 things at 80%. So remember, don't try and be last of the late brakers. Perfect your braking technique. You will find more time by braking a little earlier and having really good braking technique and getting the car really nicely rotated so you can get back to full power sooner than you will by braking later. In real racing, when you get to that, then we can work on also doing what's called compressing your brake zone, which means keeping the right technique and adding in a firmer initial brake pressure so you can brake a little later. But in HPDE, you want to absolutely focus on the technique as opposed to how late can I brake. Everybody on this call, I'm sure, has heard of the saying, slow in, fast out. This is the easiest way to find lap time. There are a few corners on the racetrack where, there's another corner immediately afterwards and your exit doesn't mean that much. That's okay. Don't focus on those corners first. Those corners are harder to get right. The lap time is harder to find. Focus on the low-hanging fruit first. Focus on the corners where if you get a really good exit, there's a strong straight afterwards. Focus on those corners. Focus on trying to perfect that braking technique into the corner so you can get the car to rotate for you, so you can get to full power sooner and get a better exit onto that long straight. It's really, really easy when you're trying to go fast to drive a car into the corners too hard. One of the guys whom I work with, he's very good. He actually has a Porsche Cup Car 991.1 race car. And we were at Sebring just a few weeks ago. And at Sebring, there is a long carousel turn 5, that leads onto a long back straight. It's a 3rd gear corner. It's a long corner. And it's very, very easy to overdrive the entry. So I'm standing up on the hill watching this, and he's driving the car into this corner as hard as he can, and he's got understeer. The car won't turn in. So he's telling me on the radio and telling the engineer that he's got understeer. And I'm like, dude, you don't have understeer. The car will turn in just fine. You were standing there. You could see it. What do you mean? I'm like, you're trying to brake too late, and you're trying to add steering while you still have brake pressure. So then he goes out the next session and he still has understeer because he's popping off the brake too quickly and too early. And the weight of the car was ding, like this as he's trying to add steering. So he was still convinced he had understeer. So I went out in his car and I did 3 laps, and we were able to look at the video and look at the data and look at the differences between us so that he could see that, yes, I am slower than him in the brake zone to the apex of that corner. But guess what? I am so much faster from the apex of that corner to the brake zone at the next corner at the start of the next straight that I'm 4 tenths faster than you in one corner. So look for the low-hanging fruit first. For him to drive slower into that corner and make the car work less hard means he's taking less risk, and he gets more lap time from it. Look for the stuff that's easier first. Focus on the stuff that's really hard later. That's the biggest piece of advice I can give you. The next thing we have happen is people often don't understand what they're looking at. People, they get these data systems in their cars for the first time. You pull it up. Make sure you know what you're looking at. I know that sounds really dumb and obvious, but honestly, knowing how to use data is really important to getting it to help you go faster. Know what your throttle trace should look like. Know what your brake trace should look like, which, by the way, should have a fairly rapid rise and then a descent that kind of looks like that. I know my screen's a little blurry with the background behind me, but you should never have like a rounded brake trace, especially in a bigger brake zone. You should always have that firm, yep, that's it, Alf, that firm initial brake input, and then be softening and softening the pedal pressure down into the corner. So when you look at the graph that shows your braking, that's what you should see. If you are overlaying one lap against another, speed trace is a really good one to look at. Don't just look at your speed through the corners. Because if you are 3 to 4 miles per hour faster through the apex of the corner, like my client was in the cup car at Sebring, but then you are slower all the way down the next straight, you are trying to make that slow corner too fast. So instead, you have to back up the corner and focus more on your exit. Making sure that you also pull up the revs can be pretty important, especially if you have somebody to look to. The rev line, obviously, when you shift gear, you'll be able to see the rev line kind of like move and do the little jump. So if somebody's going through a corner and you have their data trace compared to yours, you can line up the two rev lines versus the speed trace through the minimum of the corner and the exit and see which gear is better. Maybe if you're doing the corner in third gear, you go faster through the middle, but you're slower down the straight because you can't accelerate off the corner. Maybe it's better to do it in second gear and come out of the corner better. Data can tell you all of these really cool things if you know what you're looking for and know what you're looking at. But here's the biggest and most important thing of all. Don't obsess over it. The moment you start obsessing over your data, you will go slower on the racetrack. Use it as a tool to help you and look for trends. Look at the data and go, okay, in those 3 slower corners that all lead onto relatively long straights, I'm trying to go into the corners too fast and I'm not getting out. I'm going to go ahead and fix that. Look at the data and say, in all of the big brake traces, my brake traces look like really round, so I'm taking too long to get to that firm pressure. And then I'm dropping it too quickly and I'm not softening and having that trail into the corner. Okay. I need to try and go and fix that technique. Look for your throttle traces. If you look at your throttle trace and there's a certain corner and like, it's taking this really, really long time to get to maximum throttle, and you're looking at it and you're like, that corner, I don't think it should be taking me that long to get to full throttle because it's leading onto a straight and it's a fairly simple corner. Like, I wonder what I'm doing at the apex or with my steering that's not allowing me to get back to full power sooner. I'm going to go watch my video and think about that when I'm next on track. So use the data to help you with these big things. The other thing is if you insist on having a lap timer in your car, and I know Bill and Tom and a lot of HPDE higher ups are not fans of this, because often having a lap timer encourages you to chase lap time and try to drive faster instead of trying to do the right things, which actually ultimately will make you both faster and safer. But if you really want something in your car, I strongly, strongly, strongly cannot advise enough a system that gives you a plus or minus on a predictive time. The reasoning for that is now you can work on specific corners outside of the whole lap. So when I was driving my client's car, the reason I knew that I was slower into this corner than him is because that message told me. However, then as I'm coming onto the straight, I'm watching the time go whee, the other direction the entire way down the straight. And I'm like, okay. So I'm slower than him on this tiny bit of the racetrack, but this tells me that what I'm telling him and my way of doing it is actually better. So it's instant feedback for you when you're trying to work on a specific area of the racetrack. It will also help you when you are a faster driver to not get frustrated when you are around traffic, because this is HPDE. You're meant to be having fun. You're going to be passing people. There's going to be point buys. And if you're really good and quite fast, you're probably going to be passing quite a few people. Having a predictive allows you to work on specific corners without getting frustrated about the fact that maybe you can't see that gain or loss over the entire lap And I really like the fact that it gives you that sort of instant feedback. Like, yeah, now you're doing this better. Like, you're still doing the same. Ooh, now you're trying too hard and that's getting worse. Because as we keep discussing, the easiest way to go slower on any racetrack, in any car, whether it's a road car, race car, is trying too hard to chase the lap time rather than working really hard on your technique and allowing the lap time to come to you. One other quick thing I want to touch on while we're sort of on the data and video section of this section is please remember when you're at HPDE days that your instructors are there for their days as well. They are also there to drive their cars. They may be helping more than one student. So it's not fair for you to get out of your car and ask to monopolize your instructor and ask them to spend, a large amount of time with you going over your video and your data once you get faster. If you're getting to that point, this is not a sales pitch, but potentially you need to think about employing somebody like me to come and help you do that stuff. Or again, we're back to that whole perhaps it's time to speak to somebody. And again, that can be somebody like me about getting in a race car and actually really working hard on that and trying to look for those last little bits. Remember, HPDE, fun, enjoyment, actually going racing, that's where you're really focused on those last few tenths of a second. That being said, if you guys have questions about data and video, because I know I'm rattling through this at some pace and there's a lot of information being imparted, please pipe up, put them in the comments because I'd love to answer any of those questions you have.
Great. I do have one question about, track maps and and in particular, how do you use track maps, with your coaching clients, and how do you recommend people use track maps in general?
So I find track maps are really, really helpful because they literally show you the layout of the track and they allow you to talk to somebody outside of the car about what's happening in various corners. When you're inside the car, it's really easy to get overloaded with information. When you're outside and you're looking at a map, like, okay, so this is turn one, and in turn one, the car is doing X, Y, and Z. I'm doing this. I need to change what I'm doing. Looking at a map is helpful because you can literally draw the lines on it and you can make sure you're talking about the right corners, right? I know this sounds really dumb, that in an Indy car and a lot of pro level racing teams, they actually print these little tiny miniature track maps and put them on the wheel so that the drivers and engineers make sure they're referring to the same corner number when the corners don't have names when talking about something. So that's a reason why track maps are really important.
Right. So here's a question. I think the driver wants to overturn the laws of physics, but we'll see.
Okay.
Slightly off topic from data, but what are your techniques to get the same apex speed and exit speed when overtaking a car offline? How do you set up the corner to still achieve the same speed at the end of the following straight?
Okay, you sacrifice your apex speed. That's what you do. So you have to understand that you're coming into the corner from a tighter angle. You're going to need to slow up more, and you're going to need to slow your entry more. You want to get to the apex, A first, and be under control. So in an HPDE day, this shouldn't even really be a thing because the passing should be very controlled. But in a racing circumstance, you want to be alongside that person. You want to control the apex, but your exit is much more important than your exit speed is much more important than your apex speed. Being able to A, get to the apex, B, get the car to rotate appropriately as you finish releasing the braking so that you can get back to full power at the same point as you could if you were on the traditional line. That's the key to getting it done.
Great. So someone's asking, which data system do you recommend? Garmin, AIM, VBox, et cetera.
VBox. I'm aware VBox is the pricier of the systems out there, but quite frankly, it's so easy to use. I love the fact that you can side-by-side videos with real ease. I've worked with AIM quite a bit too. AIM is much less expensive for the most part and is also pretty good. But if you are willing to spend the money on VBox and having somebody set it up properly with, the 2 cameras, and then also making sure that you have you want to have, if at all possible, brake, throttle, and revs are the most important ones, and the wheel speed sensors to give you wheel speed. Those are the most important things that you want, and that'll give you the information that you need. Everything else you can pretty much see from that. And there are other channels and pots and things you can add, but that would be my strongest recommendation is from all of the stuff I've used, VBox is the simplest and easiest to use. And so far, any of the updates on it have also been pretty simple. So I really like the VBox thing.
Okay, great. Sounds like somebody's going to go buy a VBox. So.
I am not a dealer for VBox. Like, that is not an infomercial. It's genuinely, I've used a few things, and that's the easiest one to me.
Okay, that's great. And other questions, folks? I don't know what else you have. I have a couple of driving things we'll get to, but I forget what else is on your agenda first. So
the final sort of segment of this I was going to cover, and we talked about this a little earlier today, and we sort of touched on this earlier with this group, but didn't cover it in any detail, is how to learn a racetrack. So we've sort of gone through sort of kind of getting more and more advanced, and now we're going back to the beginning a little bit. But as you get faster and more advanced in your driving, the ability to learn a racetrack properly is still really, really important. So the point of DE, again, is to have fun with your car. And to have fun with your car, you kind of need to know where you're going and what speed you're going to be doing. So how do you learn a new racetrack safely? The first thing is, whenever possible, walk the racetrack. I like to walk the racetrack forwards, as we talked about. I do occasionally look backwards and look from the apex to the entry, or look back from exit to apex, but I like to walk the racetrack forwards because that to me starts to build a better sight picture. If I have a bicycle, I'm also very happy to cycle around the racetrack in the correct direction, maybe 2 to 3 times, as opposed to walking it once, depending on the track rules. If you have access to any kind of online sim, that's also a really good way to just kind of learn the basic layout of the racetrack. Even really, really good sims, I don't recommend for learning the nuance of the racetrack, but for learning, which way the track goes next, what's happening after this blind crest, and roughly what speed range the corners are in, learning something on a sim can be super helpful. A lot of people like to watch YouTube videos to learn racetracks. Make sure you know who's driving the car. There are a lot of people out there with some really interesting lines and things they're doing on YouTube videos with racetracks. So be a little careful with YouTube and make sure you're looking for somebody who knows how to drive if you're going to use YouTube to learn a racetrack. There are also services, and I believe one of them is Speed Secrets, that offer you a printout with a step-by-step, corner-by-corner sort of printed notes on the track before you get there. If that's an easier way for you to learn, that's potentially also something to look into. For people who employ somebody like me when we go to race weekends, I give people a 1-lap onboard from one of the cars I've driven at that track if I can. If I don't have an onboard of myself, I go find a YouTube video that I approve of and send them the link to that video. Then I supply them with a track map that has the corner numbers and names on it. And I supply them with normally a 4-page-ish document where we break the corners down one by one. And it's saying, this is a blind entry, medium speed corner. You can expect to brake roughly between the 4 and the 3 marker. It's going to be a firm pressure. The track drops away at entry, so you're going to need to trail the brakes. Use the 1 marker roughly as your entry point in your first laps. Make sure your eyes stay up. Roll the speed through the corner. Don't shift down an extra gear to 3rd. Allow the car to stay in 4th gear. All of the road, right? So that's what my notes would say to people when we're going to track, just giving them those sort of rough ideas of what to expect at each corner when we get there. Once you're ready to start driving at the track, make sure you do those first sessions at a slower pace than your normal pace, and commit to that for an entire session if you can. again, that whole sight picture thing, building it up so that your brain has the information and kind of remembers it, and as much of this as possible starts to become subliminal, for want of a better word, as soon as possible. So you're not having to think, okay, which way does it go next? What speed is it next? By doing it slower at first, you give your brain more time to process and store that information. Now, on a race weekend, there is more emphasis on being able to learn a racetrack more quickly. But in HPDE, you should take your time building up to speed and learning that racetrack. By taking your time and giving yourself the ability to process and learn that information, you will get faster quicker once you are ready to start adding pace, especially as a more inexperienced driver. Lean on your instructor. Make sure you are going at a pace at which you can absorb the information they're giving you, as well as trying to absorb the new racetrack, which may be even a little slower again at first, but lean on them. Ask to ride in your instructor's car in one group up. That's a really good way to help your learning curve progress and keep learning a new racetrack. So those are my biggest tips. The other big thing is, unless you are at a race weekend and you are about to go racing, don't be using data during your first sessions at a new track. Give yourself the space and time to learn that track before you start trying to dig into these little small and more specific nuances of it. So to me, those are the really important points about trying to learn a racetrack. The final thing that I want to add to this column is something we've talked about a lot with HPDE versus racing, but this is actually the same whether you're doing HPDE or at a race event. In your first laps of the racetrack, understand which areas of the racetrack are high risk and build up to speed more slowly in those areas. This means that on those first laps, when you are going at less speed, when you are walking the racetrack, when you are cycling the racetrack, when you are watching YouTube videos, but this is actually easier to do in person, note the areas like, okay, it's not much runoff around here and the walls are pretty close. I need to build up pretty slowly in this area of the racetrack. I need to mind my P's and Q's around here. Like, okay, this area of the racetrack's pretty open. I still don't want to make a mistake, but this is an area of the racetrack with less risk. A little story from my own racing background for you all. I was at a race, again, at Laguna Seca, funnily enough, a few years ago, in a Lamborghini Super Trofeo car. And my teammate and I were competing for the overall podium and podiumed in our class twice. But when we looked at the data at the end of the practice before qualifying, the engineer looked at me and he said to me, "Why are you so much slower through this one turn?" It was turn 10, which in Laguna is a downhill, fast sweeping left-hand corner. And there's a big wall on the left-hand side of it. And the team owner and I had the conversation before the race weekend of, I'd scratched together enough sponsorship to be in the car alongside this co-driver there. He was a wealthy gentleman driver, but he's very, very, very good. I had very limited experience. So he's like, well, I'll drive with you, but I'm not going to pay for you. And so the deal was that if I hurt the car, the gentleman driver and the team owner would pay the insurance deductible, but then I didn't get to drive it the rest of the weekend because now I'm eating to their money. And so I looked at this guy and I said, there's a wall to the left there. Let's look at other places where I can go faster instead, because I'm not going to go any faster through that corner. And we came second in our class and fourth overall in both races. We had a really good weekend, but I just looked at that area of the racetrack and I'm like, the risk versus reward ratio, even on a race weekend for me, I'm not going to drive that car any faster through that corner. And it's the same thing for me now when I'm getting in my clients' cars all of the time. I'm constantly weighing the risk versus reward in the same way you should, whether it's HPDE or a race weekend, because trust me, if you don't want to face Bill and Tom or your husband or your wife, if you crash your car during an HPDE, I do not want to face my client if I bin his race car. So that risk versus reward assessment when you're learning a new track is really, really important.
Great. Good stuff. Good stuff. So we have some questions. How many days a year are you driving on track?
Oh, I don't know. Last year, including travel days and days where I wasn't driving, but I was just coaching, standing around with a radio. And this included traveling to Germany and back several times last year. So those trips take a little longer. I was gone 250 days last year. I wasn't on track 250 days, but I was gone 250 days. So I'm busy.
So speaking of those tracks, tell us about driving the Nordschleife.
Okay, so that was one where the sim was, I'd never been there before last year. I'd driven on the GP circuit of the Nürburgring, and everybody who grows up in Europe knows about the Nordschleife. So the opportunity came up to go and do the race out there. And so I don't like sims. I'm not very good at sims, but I dedicated hours and hours of my life in between events, making myself miserable to put in time on the sim to learn the racetrack and learn the nuances of which way it goes where. And then for the Nordschleife specifically, it has its own special licensing procedure, which is different to everywhere else in the world because it's its own entity. So you start out, you have to apply for what's called a Permit B. And so we had a coach who did what I normally do down in Birmingham, Alabama, and was leading me and two other people around at fairly decent rate of knots in his car with the radio, chatting to us as we were going. Then you do several laps one-on-one with that person. And at that point, they're going really quite quick. I was in a race car. He was in a very fast road car, and mine was quick around the corners. So he was quicker down the straight. So he'd say things on the straight, like, come along, hurry up, catch up, let's go. I was like, dude, I'm flat out, shut up. You then get what's called your Permit B for your first two races, and you have to do your first races there in a relatively slower car, which obviously is pretty sensible given the environment in which you're racing, because it's somewhat unforgiving and there's not much margin for error, most of that track. The most interesting thing was I'd never been in a racing situation before where you'd literally use your turn signals for point bias for the faster cars. Because if you didn't, you will get moved. And that's going to be unpleasant all the way around. So I'd never been in that type of racing situation before. The difference in speed between a GT3 car and the speed of cars they have you driving at first is significant. Imagine an IMSA GTD car on track at the same time as a chump car. It's kind of like that. It's big. And they're coming round despite the length of lap, like every 6 laps or so. So you have to be very, very heads up. There's always a ton of traffic. The weather's never the same on one side of the track as the other. That's not a myth. In one of the stints I did in the race, by the way, we won our class. We didn't win overall, to clarify. One of the stints I did in the race, we were in an Audi GT4. I was on cut slicks. And on the front straight and most of the GP circuit, it was so wet, I could barely hang on. I was almost crashing. In the first part of the Nordschleife, it was dry, but my front tires were so cold from being in the water on the GP circuit that I had horrendous understeer. I'd just get them warm enough and then enter another period of the racetrack that was really wet and you were like dying trying to stay on. And of course, you don't come back around for like another 8 minutes. So it's not like you're seeing it every 2 to 3 minutes. And in those conditions, it's not 8 minutes, it's like 10 minutes. So it's changed. Has it changed for the better? Has it changed for the worse? Don't know until you get there. And guess what? It's probably going to be blind as well. So you just arrive and there's a lot of having to adapt and adjust and think on your feet.
That's great. So somebody wants to know what your 3 favorite tracks are in the US and why.
Oh, that's actually a really, really hard question. So obviously the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in an Indy car, when it's set up right, is very, very hard to beat in terms of an experience. I generally really like slightly older racetracks where there's consequences if you make a mistake. That's why I'm pretty good at Indy and why I was quite good out on the Nordschleife. I tend to like fast racetracks where you have to be really smooth with your inputs from the car to get the best from it. Again, Nordschleife, Indy, seeing a couple of parallels here. So what road circuits do I really like in the US? Watkins Glen is right up there as a big favorite of mine. Very fast racetrack. You can get so much time there by being really smooth and really good with your inputs for the car. I really enjoy that. VIR is up there, another kind of fast old racetrack with some consequences if you get it wrong. I'm going to go more than 3. I'm sorry. I really enjoy Barber Motorsports Park. It's a little bit less old-fashioned, but it's like my home track. I spend so much time there with Porsche track experience that whenever we go there for racing, I'm like, whoa, here we go, here we go. Completely different to all of the other tracks I've just named. I also really like Sebring. It's so bumpy, and the bumps are like that third element of elevation that you get in those other tracks I like. So even though it's flat, the bumps like really add something to the character of it. And to me, it's a really interesting racetrack to drive quickly. And surprisingly, being smooth at Sebring in most cars actually brings a lot of speed. So I enjoy Sebring quite a lot too.
Great. Somebody asked if you've driven Mosport.
I have not driven Mosport, but I hear great things about it.
Now, earlier today, I asked you about driving. Somebody wanted to ask you
Oh,
about
sorry,
driving.
I missed one. Road
Okay.
America. How did I leave Road America off that list? Yeah, that's up there, Road America. Carry on. Sorry,
Yeah.
had to drop that in.
Perfectly fine. So earlier we talked about Indianapolis early in the day, and somebody wanted to know what it's like to drive over 200, never mind 230 miles an hour at Indianapolis. So if you wouldn't mind going through that again, we all enjoyed that.
Absolutely. So here's the big deal with an Indy car, the Indianapolis 500. I'm going to give you guys a short answer first. When the car's set up well and it's right, it actually feels really quite good there, and it can be a lot of fun. But when the car's not right at those speeds, it's really ugly. And, when you're going that fast and you're just trying to hang on and like save your skin and not be a scattering of race car parts sort of every turn of every lap, that is a long lap and a long race, and it takes a lot out of you. To dig into this a little deeper, what you are looking for from your race car at the Indianapolis 500 is you have enough downforce on the car that when you're by yourself, the car should be relatively easy to drive flat out through all 4 corners of the track. You don't want any understeer when you're by yourself. You want maybe a tiny bit of oversteer, the rear just being a tiny bit free. But you want to be as close as you can figure it out to the perfect car as possible. The problem is the downforce that you're running, the amount you're pushing down into the racetrack, also masks some of the handling things that are going on. So you can think your car is fairly good. And then you start to play with traffic. And you get behind these other cars and they create a wake coming off the back of the car. If you've ever seen a powerboat in water, it's like that, but with air. And so trying to navigate through that wake does all sorts of things to your car. You have less downforce, primarily less front downforce first. And then as you get into the middle of the corner and like maybe that car's like pulled out a little further ahead of you and you get air back on the front wing, it's still disturbed. You have less front downforce than you would in clean air. But now you just added some front downforce back and you took away some rear downforce. So things get interesting in the middle of the corner really, really quickly and in a hurry when you're trying to set the car up to do well in traffic. So quite frankly, doing runs by yourself in race downforce doesn't really help. You're always looking for other people to run behind so that you can try and figure out what the car does behind them and how to make it better. Inside the car, you have front and rear anti-roll bar adjusters. So you can soften the front roll bar, make the car turn better, like the nose go forwards more easily, just like if you were setting up a road course car. You can also soften or stiffen the rear anti-roll bar. Stiffening the rear anti-roll bar, just like a road course, props the rear up, makes the car turn more easily, but now it's turning from the rear rather than from the front. Or you can soften it and like make the car sit down on the back more easily, which makes it understeer more and want to turn less. We also have a tool in the car called a weight jacker. Now, if you imagine the race car is a table, my hand is my table, take one of those legs out and put a spring in the middle of it. Drop the spring, put the weight to the inside, make the car turn more, raise the spring up, put the weight to the right rear, the car turns less. That's a weight jacker. So when you're driving the car in traffic, you are working these three tools to try and help the car keep turning so that you can get close enough to get the run to actually make the pass. Now, if your car is really, really good, it's about a half a lap setup. And if your car is more normal, which are the kind of cars I drive, it's roughly an entire lap to set up to make the pass the next lap into that corner. So there's a lot of thinking ahead involved and a lot of kind of timing and work involved with that. Now, here's one of the other things. An Indy car in qualifying trim at the Indy 500, no matter how good your car is, those are still the scariest, worst 4 laps you will drive in a race car the entire year. Because you are trimming the car out and taking so much downforce off, because every time you add downforce, right, you're slowing the car down. You're pushing it down into the racetrack. So you're trying to find the limit of how sketchy can I make this and survive? How little downforce can I survive with? And so now you're trying to tune the car with little downforce. And again, you don't want understeer. You actually want the back to be moving a little bit. Think about that at 230 miles an hour. You can generally be flat for your first 2 laps in qualifying. By lap 3, you're generally lifting, and every lap you're moving those tools inside of the car to try and keep the tires underneath you, because in these 4 laps with so little downforce, you're asking so much of the tires that you're really using them up over this 4-lap run. By lap 4, you're generally not flat out into 1. You might be flat out into 3, but probably not. And by the time you come out of 4, you're just hanging on like, get me to that line, get me to that line. And the flag comes out, you're like, oh God. If you wonder why everybody dumps throttle the moment they cross the finish line, then nobody wants to go and turn 1 fast again in that setup unless they have to on tires that have done that many laps. Like you're not dumping throttle because you're that light on fuel. You're dumping throttle like, and I'm out. It's qualifying at Indy is a big thing. Even in the years where there have only been 33 cars there, like do not underestimate the level of stress and pressure and how hard it is to drive one of those damn things that trimmed out.
So somebody wants to know what your favorite race was when driving an Indy car other than at Indy.
So I'm in this really weird situation. I ran Indy Lights full time on my way to IndyCar, but like many drivers, I never actually had the budget to graduate to IndyCar full time. So I bounced in and out of the Indy 500 several times with lots of small teams and team owners who were willing to basically stump up significant portions of the budget to help me be in their car for that one race. And the only other races that I've driven Indy cars at, so I'm going to say this with a lot of respect because I'm very thankful. And without this team owner, I would never have done several Indy 500s. He's going to remain nameless. Those of you who know the sport can work it out. So this is somebody who's been very good to me. Our cars were not always great. There was a period in time where his cars were notorious for not being great on pretty much all of the ovals. And his business model was ideally, he wanted drivers with sponsors to pay to come and drive his cars because, in the end, you got to pay to run the car. And he would have one driver whom he was paying or whom the engine manufacturer was paying for or whom the sponsor was paying for. And that car would still be running a budget and the driver would not be commanding the salary they could elsewhere, but they wanted to keep racing, so they'd do it. And then the other car was meant to be somebody who was helping finance the team a bit and quite frankly, pay for that first driver to be there. This team owner, again, very good person, not known for communication skills. So this would mean that on Monday, sometimes on Tuesday, I'd get this email and it would show up in my email inbox. It would be a travel list. And my name would be on a travel list. I'd be listed as on a flight and it leaves at this time. And I'm on the hotel rooming list. At which point I would pick up the phone and call my team manager, whose name at the time was Darren. I'd be like, Darren? Yeah, I just got an email. Uh-huh, I got the same one. I'm like, I'm on the flight list and rooming list. And he's like, wait, you getting on the plane? I'm like, all right. And so I'd show up Thursday morning and get on the plane and, you know, jump in the car on Friday and try and drive it on Saturday. So that was what most of my experience was like outside of the Indy 500. And sometimes I did okay in those scenarios, and sometimes I really didn't, which, looking back, quite frankly, in those circumstances at that level of competition is pretty acceptable. But, you know, that's not how the outside world, who doesn't have all of the facts, views it most of the time, especially given the fact that I was getting into the car that, you know, that the driver's normally paying for. But the deal was, is when nobody wanted to pay in that car on that race about 2 days before the plane would leave, again, the team owner wouldn't actually call me. I'd literally get a travel email from the secretary that I would be on. And then I would pick up the phone and call the team manager on his cell phone and be like, did you just get the same email I got? Like, am I on your email too? Because if I'm on your email too, I'll get on the damn plane. And in the same vein, there was one race that I ran with that, again, race will remain nameless. There was one race that I ran with that team where we actually had a fairly good car. But there was a lot of stuff going on in the race that I was like, I don't want to be part of that. And in that race, we came 13th out of like 26 cars, which, you know, frankly, for the type of operation we had was pretty good. Aside from an issue that was, I'll tell you guys the issue actually. So there was a yellow flag pretty close to the end, and the accident happened right in front of me, and I had to stand on the brakes to avoid the accident. So I flat spotted my tires. I made them swear like boop, 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 boop. They then decided to red flag the race. Zero issues with that decision, so that they could finish the race under green, right? Rather than have us like traipse around for 15 laps under yellow, let's red flag the race and finish. Zero issues with that decision. Because my guys weren't very high up in the points, their pit box was all the way at the other end of pit lane. So when the officials let the cars back out on the track, they didn't wait long enough to open pit lane. They opened it too soon. And so I couldn't come to pit lane and get non-square tires. So at the restart of the race, I just had to ride around as like the last car on that lap and come home. Whereas if the officials had actually waited until the small teams had their people in position and I could have had new non-square tires too, we probably could have been in the top 10 that day. So that's one of those instances where people are like, yeah, she finished last on the lead lap. And I'm like, screw you guys, we did a really good job with what we had and we should be happy about it. So the internal versus the external is quite different. And that's sort of why I can't really answer your question about which was my favorite track that I ran outside of Indy, because I never really got a fair shot at any of them, if I'm being honest.
Okay. So an Indy question, somebody's asking it, since the sun late in the afternoon is behind the grandstands, does the shade in turn one affect the car and or what you can see?
Does it affect what you can see? Not in terms of the sun in your eyes, but at turn one at Indianapolis, the track goes from darker to slightly lighter. And I always base my turning point on placing my outside wheels there, so that becomes a little more shaded. Does it affect the handling of the car? Yes. In general, the car gets a little faster and it turns into turn one a little easier.
Okay, great. Thank you. Other questions, folks? We're about to wrap up. Going once. Any last minute thoughts, Pippa, as we wrap up?
I just want to say again, thank you so much, everybody, for having me. You guys were a really quiet audience, so I hope I didn't bore your socks off too much with imparting the information this afternoon. I see some of you smiling, so hopefully I did okay with those of you whom I see smiling. Thank you for having me. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for putting up and listening to me. And I hope you guys have a great season with your Region Porsche Club. You've got some great tracks on the schedule, so have fun and enjoy your cars.
Great. Great. Thank you very much, Pippa. Tom, I'll let you
Yeah.
wrap it up.
Pippa, thank you very much. This certainly has been a pleasure for both seminars, and so glad you made the time to teach us, to give us your knowledge, and it's been, like I say, a real pleasure, and hopefully we could do it again someday.
Thank you.
And good luck in your future.
Thank you very much.
Everyone have a great day. We'll see you at the track soon.
Thanks,
care.
guys.
Bye-bye.
See if we can. Let's see. Still got a few people on here.
A couple of people definitely walked away from their
Yep.
video.
Yep. Yeah, let me just get rid of okay, so all right. So very good.
Yeah, I getting a couple more emails and texts. A couple of people said it's the best program we've had. So I think if we